Welcome everyone, Dr. Thor here, and get ready for Gnosis. Well, let's cover the unending debate or comments on the famous Bruce Lee and why stuntmen hated him. And they hated him for a very real reason. Now, I grew up in the Hollywood area and knew stuntmen, actors, etc. Knew people who worked at the studios and actually have been in most of the studios because of that. And of course, Bruce Lee was a little bit before my time, or at least I was very young. I also trained with famous martial artists in that area, particularly Chuck Norris. Not for many lessons, but I had one lesson with him, and then of course he had other people, his brother, etc. So I had a little bit there, and of course most people who spoke of Bruce Lee, particularly as a fellow martial artist, had nothing but good things to say about him. People that worked with him were quite different. And there was lots of problems involved here, as with everything. Bruce Lee was a regular guy, but he's a very, very smart guy on every level. And all of you people out there that seem to don't listen to these particular videos properly and just want to hear some sort of glorious comments of how wonderful somebody is endlessly, you have the brain of a retarded gnat and probably won't get anything that I really say here. I've never criticized Bruce Lee in any area that hasn't been talked about in other areas. And we're not going to go into, if you want to listen to my other commentaries, there's many of them stating facts, and they're not from me. I quote other people who worked directly with them. So, you have to listen to things and understand. The minute somebody hears something negative, they think the entire thing is negative. It's not true. That's like saying with any person, they're perfect. So let's change Bruce Lee's name to Bruce Jesus Christ Lee for all you people out there, the perfect individual as we see it. But the bottom line is that anybody who's studied the mythical Christ understands all the problems related to that as well, as with anyone. But the bottom line is that Bruce Lee was a very intelligent actor who grew up in an acting family, was on acting sets when he was a child, had starring roles, etc. That's what Daddy did. And we're going to also talk about the racism against Bruce Lee that happened. And of course, the racism against Bruce Lee was by his own people, because they didn't consider him Chinese because he had some apparent European blood. But that'd be another discussion we'll have here for all you bozos out there that don't have the facts because you read comic books apparently. So the reason why he was disliked by particularly stuntmen is that he grew up in Hong Kong reality. One of the problems with Lee is that he really never was on the other side of the camera. So he really never saw what's happening, and this is a huge mistake. Even though he was a very smart guy and knew what looked good on camera from a certain angle, meaning a direct face shot, he really didn't understand the mechanics of what it took to particularly do a fight scene. And further proved this by he was given a chance to do fight scenes and couldn't film them properly and refused to ever film them again. Now, he was very smart of being following directors and looking at pictures of people from the actor's point of view and knew what was cool, what looked good. So very, very smart man of knowing how to manipulate what the public was looking for. And that's what exactly he did. And people give him way too much credit in all sorts of areas. And the bottom line is he did most of this to make a successful life for himself and to have a career. How much he believed in this or other things is not. He did do extremely special things that he must be given credit for, and really is the person who changed martial arts. And did he change martial arts because he was the best fighter out there and could beat everybody? Well, that's the flea-headed fools out there that think that's only what martial arts is about. And the bottom line, that's kind of an imbecilic way of doing things. That, and you've been brainwashed by karate schools and other things to think that katas are real fighting and all the other things that happen. It's just not true. And real combat is very different than all these things, including street fighting, which is not necessarily real combat. But the point is that he saw no value of, and probably was very correct. Why go to tournaments? And even if you win, what does that mean? It means virtually nothing in the world. It doesn't really help you, and having that on your credibility or your resume is only cared about by people that are in that particular, quote, reality. It doesn't really get you anywhere. I don't hear anybody screaming that Chuck Norris, I believe, was 5 times world champion. People like to ignore the fact that Van Damme was a champion. Nobody really cares. So the whole idea is this is something that is a whole nother thing. And of course, there's a debate over this point karate, which is another thing. You don't necessarily want to kick each other, but they did come up with, thanks to probably the greatest fighter of all time, who was disgraced because he was stupid, unlike the smart Lee, who got every place. Why? He got every place because he was an Asian. Just like if you want to be an acupuncturist and you're not an Asian, well, you're going to be discriminated against. You open up a Chinese restaurant and you're not Chinese, people will say, how do you know how to make the food? This is the prejudice that goes on all the time against whatever it is. You open a soul food restaurant and you're a white guy from Brooklyn, people are not going to go to your restaurant. So this is the kind of racism that's out there, and everybody likes to blame racism on other people. And I've never really found this to be true. I'm sure it happens and happens to a fair degree, but the bottom line is I've seen nothing but all sorts of racism against myself from who is white, from other whites who treat me like garbage because I wasn't in their, quote, class. So I haven't seen anybody. I've worked under blacks, women, Mexicans, everything. I wasn't given those jobs. So this kind of stuff that they don't get jobs, they don't get up to, is nonsense. It just isn't the real world. It's an excuse. Certainly there is horrible racism, particularly against blacks all around the world, and the United States in particular, where they're murdered in the streets. And where are you, karate boys? I don't see you out in the streets protesting. I don't see you hunting down the murderous, traitorous police. Nor do you seem to care any bit whatsoever about the fact that Bruce Lee was murdered. He was murdered by other Chinese because he stood up to them. Oh, it's all the bad whiteys in Hollywood. Well, the point is Bruce Lee was given numerous opportunities in Hollywood. By the way, Hollywood ain't an easy place to get a job. He got a job because what? Because he was so talented. He spoke English so well. I think his English was wonderful. Is that why he got jobs? No, he got jobs because he was Asian. And particularly at a time when martial arts and equality was looming in space. But you don't see very many Asians on TV today now either. So the whole idea is that everybody doesn't care. They don't care he was murdered. They don't care there's all sorts of racism still going on. And the point is that this is just the ignorance of particularly people who want to hide and point out stupidity. If anything, Bruce Lee was not in any way had a racism against him. He was given breaks because of it. The fact that they cast in the the late 60s in Green Hornet and then Long Street and other places that he got parts is ridiculous to think that there was racism when there was literally tens of thousands of people, white people, who can't get jobs in Hollywood because it's very little work there. And very few people can make it in Hollywood, period. The fact that he got screen time and he was taken seriously in itself shows that there is no racism. It's nonsense. The fact that in the late 1960s, early 70s, whenever Kung Fu came out, the TV series, he was interviewed, taken seriously. The people on that staff of that particular TV show had Asian advisors in Kung Fu, etc., as well as Asian advisors in the philosophical areas. There was a problem stated by the producers, and I fully agree with them, that Lee really didn't speak English clear enough to go to that kind of middle-class audience in the 1970s, and there would be an uproar of the people not being able to understand him. Now, you can argue that or not, it's the truth. And that's, of course, what the producer himself said. Oh, you're saying. No, no, these are quotes from all the other people. All you have to do is, of course, I'm sure you people out there, all you have to do is go get the Kung Fu DVDs and listen to the commentaries, which they have the actual producer of that show stating that they couldn't understand him well enough to put him in that part. And there are certain other things, meaning the fact that he was a little bit too small to be a hero in their minds. So there's a lot of different factors when we're talking about a lot of different times. But what times? Where are the martial arts movies coming out today? You can't even find them. Mostly gun movies with a little bit of martial arts. Where are the TV shows? With all the TV shows being produced today, with all the open hours, there's zero that I'm aware of any martial arts series other than the actual Karate Kid. This is the one standalone course TV show. There was one other one I can't remember that had one quick season, which I really enjoyed, which was more a mystical. But there are none. And there hasn't been really a hit in the martial arts series on television, period. There are basically only two shows that made it for 3 years. I think that Kung Fu made it for 3 years, and so did one of my favorite shows was Martial Arts, or Martial Law, I'm sorry, with Sammo Young. Great series, fun, had every elements there, lots of good fight scenes, and the stories were good with Arsenio Hall. It was a great show, didn't make it. There were many other shows tried, and they all failed. Black Sash, which was one of my favorite martial arts series. I believe it's Carlton Cruz. That was big into this and had tried to get many series, and none of them ever worked. So you don't support anything out there either. It amazes me with the amount of people learning martial arts that there is hardly no media dedicated to it. So I'm not even sure there was comic books at the time by Marvel. And I believe there was even a series based on that Kung Fu Master or whatever it is. That flopped as well. We go and have Doctor Strange made in the modern world, and the actual main person there, that was one of the advisors to Doctor Strange, they turned into a white woman when it should have been a male Asian or a female. And his excuse for that is that he couldn't really produce a character that didn't come off racist. So instead of not having an Asian, so putting a white person in there was not racist. I mean, this is the kind of stupidity that you get from Hollywood, which, of course, is permeated around the world. So as we get into all these things, we need, and let's get back into who Bruce Lee. I've wandered here about why stuntmen didn't like him. And all of this stuff has been talked about and can be fine. Now, people like to criticize Tarantino, but Tarantino made a movie based on a book. Some people think he wrote the script for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, or whatever that name is. He didn't do that. So that was still based on a book and other books that he put together there to, of course, he wrote the script eventually, but the information was taken there, and it was common knowledge of what was going on with him, and he had long talks with David Carradine, who wasn't really a great friend of Bruce Lee, and knew Bruce Lee, and he stated publicly how arrogant he became in later years. And that was well known there. But, you can't criticize Jesus Lee. The point is that he was very smart. He did what he had to do. He came over here and, of course, wanted to be seen as what? What is the ancient wise Asian? So he went to college in Seattle, I believe, and the actual locations of all this stuff doesn't mean, people point, oh, you got somebody's name wrong. It's not important, the details of it. It's what is going on. So he went to college where he met his wife, who was a Caucasian, and he took, guess what? Philosophy. And he played the great Chinese philosopher, really knowing nothing about it. He never studied any philosophy in China, was never hooked up with any kind of philosophical schools, etc. But he knew that what do white Americans want? Well, they want the kick-ass philosopher. And he was smart enough to do that, and he read everything. Now, what Lee is mostly needs to be credited for, and very highly credited for, which at that time never happened. He broke the mold of using mixed martial arts, which is very smart. So, but before that, people have no idea that before that, and somehow people think they're geniuses sitting around in the 21st century, looking back on 40, 50 years ago and think they know something because they watched Batman. So the whole idea is just nonsense. So the point is, back then, and it had nothing to do with the so-called racism and so-called white people, who basically do nothing but beat each other, was the fact that the racism from the Asian schools was the fact that you did not practice multi-traditions. Now, I know this sounds shocking now, and even sounds imbecilic, but you have to understand the imbecilic way of traditions, which are highly regarded in most societies, and particularly in Asian societies. Daddy learned this karate from grandfather. I learn now too. Me not learn anything else. So the whole idea is this is the attitude with everybody. Everybody thinks they know best. So it's just not true. So he was the first one to say, hey, look, there's some good... and he found out that when he used his traditional style that he learned in Hong Kong, which is what motivated him, whatever you want to call that style and whoever he trained from, he was getting his ass kicked from other practitioners of different martial arts, and he didn't quite like that. He found that there was very great weaknesses in the system that he learned, whatever you want to call kung fu or gung fu, however you want to call it, that system was very incomplete. And other people with grappling and other things were basically getting a particular move ahead of him. A matter of fact, it appeared that even in the school of Kung Fu, as the legend goes, that there was one student who was sick of all these other guys beating him up, and he decided to come up with his own system, which was much better, called the mantis system, I guess the praying mantis system, whatever, and he kicked the asses of all the other people there. So it goes on with the fact that if you learn one system, you're limiting yourself. And I think everybody understands that now to a degree. So you didn't do that. As a matter of fact, it was so strict in those days that if you went to a Taekwondo school, you had to get a note from that guy to say that you could learn jiu-jitsu. This is a fact. Now, all you little bozos that are post-internet don't seem to know much of anything. And this is so true of the world and why history repeats itself, because nobody remembers anything. They don't pay any attention. They don't care unless it's in their face. This is the kind of illness that society carries with it. So with all that, we have to understand that fact. Now, so he put together the multi-martial. He used everything from dance steps to fencing, you name it. He incorporated into a fighting system, which now is known as MMA, Mixed Martial Arts, which everybody uses because it just makes sense. If jiu-jitsu has a fantastic move, why not use it? Well, I'm going to ignore that because I'm only a kung fu guy. Well, isn't that kind of stupid? Well, the point is he was the first one to do that and took the brunt of it. He also was horribly attacked by the racist Chinese who were out to destroy him and eventually murdered him. Oh, you don't want to deal with that either, do you, little babies? You have problems with that? Or you want to talk about how great he is and how the whitey caused him problems, but his own people murdered him, attacked him, stopped him from getting anywhere? Well, start to grow up, people. Now, one problem, and let's get back to this without making it too long. I could talk for hours on this subject because, of course, nobody knows nothing to begin with. You don't listen to interviews. You don't watch YouTube. You don't read books. Oh, I heard it from the guy in the toilet at the train station. Yeah, he knows a lot. Yeah, we know where you're coming from, you little fanboys who worship people. As with everything in life, you need to take the good out of it and not overly make people glorified into heroes, particularly when they weren't. But it goes for everybody. He did a good job and was a great martial artist. So the whole idea is that, and did a lot of changes to that entire field of understanding, or you could call it even the martial arts industry. He changed everything and should be given credit for that. And not only was he murdered for that, they murdered his son as well, and I'll cover that in another video. So the whole idea is that he learned in Hong Kong. He learned in places where the photography and the level of skill is quite different. He also only learned from one side of what I call the cash register. Most people don't understand business because they only stand in front of the cash register. They're never behind it. They don't know the difficulties. They think you're rich because you run a business. They don't understand all the costs involved. All of these things happen and nobody really gets it. So keeping that in mind is something that we have to fully understand. So with that, we have to then understand that at a very high degree. So what did he understand? What did they do in Chinese cinema that is very different here? Well, Chinese cinema, because of the nature of it, and the fact that they didn't have a lot of photography skills, used to use very close-up shots, and people many times would actually strike each other, not with full force, but would hit. This was common. And you thinking as an actor that if it's going to be realistic, you have to hit the person. You have to physically touch them. After all, that's realism. Well, no, that isn't realism. Not when it comes to cameras. I mean, a good actor will tell you, let the camera do the work for you. You're overacting. He's right. That's why there's so many people. You ever look at how many people are involved to make one crummy little movie? Thousands. The point is that the camera angles, which magicians and other people have used, professional illusionists, otherwise known as tricksters and liars, have been using angles and illusions to create all sorts of things, and people think they're gods. Now, the same thing happens with a fight scene. If you do a fight scene correctly, you can miss the person by a foot easily and make it look like a very realistic strike. Now, a lot of people won't understand anything because, again, you're on that one side of the cash register and you only think that this is the way it looks good. And unfortunately, Lee was not that bright when it comes to lots of areas. He wasn't a great student. He was smart in terms of he knowing what people wanted. He studied stuff to a degree to come off competent. And he knew what the game was, but he didn't really understand the technicalities of things. Just like his wisdom was really taken right out of books. He didn't think of anything on his own. He said, this is supposed to be stuff, I use it. So all of this is exactly what's happening. Now, there has been many people that have reported this. One of them, of course, was his. So the whole idea is that this is what was done back then. And, of course, they didn't have the understandings and the film editing capacities, or at least the understanding of how films work. And, of course, every Chinese film is the same. If you look at them, they're almost the same exact films. It's all the same kind of fight scenes. It's all the same thing. It's actually so boring because they're moving around and doing constant fighting from the beginning of the film to the end. So, it's a very poor, technically performed most of the Hong Kong films of that time. There's been some great Hong Kong directors. Most of those came much after him and have gained some note and do some fairly good action films whose names escape me at this moment. But, back then, it was all the same stuff. You did it cheap, quick, and fast. And the whole idea is this was seen as an actor that if it's real, well, it has to be real, like in life. Well, it's not true. There's nothing in the movies that is like life. Certainly the Hong Kong films didn't. And you don't fight for 20 minutes to begin with. It's impossible to do that physically. And you can't hit somebody 20 times and they get up again. It's just all nonsense. So, this is how he learned and thought that was the way things had to be done to look good. Now, he was proven to be wrong here in many instances, and even he admitted it to himself. Now, in The Green Hornet, which again, he got a big break to do that, one of the few Asians, I don't know if he was the only Asian to have any kind of parts back then. They used to have Charlie Chan was played by Peter Ustinov, a Jewish Russian guy. And we go on and on how Asian parts were played by white people with made it into slanty eyes and with a bad accent. So he was given lots of opportunities because of what he was. He came over here saying, well, I'm this guy, I know philosophy. He built up his little studios, gave people his little 2-cent philosophies, and they thought he was wonderful. And this got him into the movies and so many other things. So the whole idea is when he got his big break, which is Green Hornet. And by the way, if everybody loved martial arts so much and was so supportive of Asians playing parts, which was given a part there, a substantial part. Some people could say the star of Green Hornet was Kato. The problem is, if that is the case, it flopped. It lasted one season at a time when Batman, which of course didn't last that long either, only 3 seasons, I believe, was very popular with its kind of campy nonsense. This Green Hornet was a little more serious, and they were trying to get higher ratings, and they even guest starred, I believe, on Batman in some sort of fight sequence to try and bring audience over there. Didn't work. Nobody cared about him. Nobody cared about Bruce Lee. Nobody cared about martial arts back then. It was not thought of as anything serious. This is relatively soon after World War II, and some people were bringing back some stuff because they were basically coming back from Japan. So the point is that's right. Chuck Norris was stationed in Korea. So this is how this started to happen here, and that started to come in, and people were. But it wasn't really a sensation back then. And all the martial arts pictures, almost to this day, you can't really state a single martial arts picture which was a big budget extravaganza. And in general, martial arts films are all cheapy, low things, so they don't really gross that much. And as I've mentioned, there's no TV shows, there's no nothing other than Karate Kid right now, which is a hit, and it's extremely well done. But I'm not sure we can call that a martial arts. It's a soap opera typey thing, but at least it's something. And certainly there isn't a Mr. Miyagi character in the new series of any great extent. So it's an interesting, well-written series, which I think is interesting to most people beyond its martial arts. And of course, are there any Asians in Karate Kid? I don't believe there is. Mr. Miyagi was the only one, and he has never been replaced with another figure like that. So here we go again with Hollywood goofing on everything. If that's important. So, Kung Fu only lasted for 3 years, wasn't really that popular ultimately. These things burn out quickly after becoming a sensation. And this would started kind of that, and these other films, and of course, Bruce Lee didn't get a Hollywood film. He was sent to Hong Kong, and then eventually followed some Hollywood producers over there to make one of a higher grade film. I believe that was Enter the Dragon. As I said, don't hold me to these things, but I mean, the point is he went over there and made these films and became an Asian sensation, and as such, was making, and he demanded from day one, he wanted a lot of money, and rightfully so. He was an American TV star and should have got higher salaries. They said, no, you're not going to get that. So I don't know what he was eventually paid or not, but once he became successful, and Bruce Lee is the ultimate consummate actor. He knew what looked good, he had the physique, he had the great looks. He learned this as a child and what makes an effect on an audience, particularly a less sophisticated Chinese audience. I mean, Bruce Lee is the ultimate hero. He does what everybody wants to do, and that is to kick the ass of all of his enemies and to try and make society better. He fought to go against the bad guys, etc. These are classic, Western-type realities where you're fighting against the bad guys. And, of course, everybody likes that. And certainly he looked cool, ultimately cool. His movements and everything else. I'm not sure how martial artists they were. They were very theatrical, and he looked fantastic. So, this didn't pay off with white people, by the way, because Van Damme came out, who probably looks the best on screen, has done the more Hollywoody type things, and has had a monicum obsessed, but he's not obsessed over as Bruce Lee is, etc. So, I mean, certainly, in terms of looking good on screen, being physique and everything else, even though, ironically, I believe he's an inch shorter than Bruce Lee, never really got the appeal that he did. And certainly was a fantastic actor, as was proven in some of his later films, but gets no respect whatsoever. But you can't argue how good he looked, these splits, these other things. This was very theatrical martial arts, and it looked great. Plain and simple. And this was a guy who owned gyms and was a bodybuilder and everything else. So you can't criticize him on his unbelievably great physique as well. Now, I'm not a great fan of his. I have problems with these people that he seems kind of juvenile to me in his kind of attitude. He has a typical kind of French Belgian attitude. Which is I don't personally find that very endearing. But the point is that's where he learned. He learned in Hong Kong. They did very close-up stuff. They hit each other all the time. This was considered part of the Oriental martial arts Hong Kong way of filming things. So when he came over to the United States, he didn't get it. He never studied. He studied a lot of things of how to put images out, but he never studied the technicality of how to make films and what they were all about. Now, during the Green Hornet series, he expressed how he thought all these fight scenes were poo-poo and how all of the stuntmen were a bunch of weasels and that we don't do this in Hong Kong. Hong Kong, we hit each other and we make it look real. So this is what he talked about, and he said, I could do this a lot better. So what they eventually did there is that his co-star here, Van Williams, and this is on YouTube, by the way, just as statements from Tarantino are. People want to say he's lying or not. Well, he's not lying. He's repeating what was commonly known in Hollywood at that time, and he talked to an awful lot of people who knew Bruce Lee personally and got it verified by stuntmen and everything else. So the point is that, and of course, there's an awful lot of people everywhere who are kind of jerks. And especially when they get a little bit of power. I mean, Hollywood is notorious for these things, including everybody else in Hollywood. But that's everywhere. Everybody that has any kind of power tends to abuse it. So they were sick and tired of hearing Bruce Lee bitch, particularly Van Williams. So Van Williams went over to the producers and said, look, let's get Lee over here and let him film a scene. And, of course, grumble, because, it costs a lot of money. In Hollywood, you got 50 people, they're all paid well, and if they're going to take 30 minutes for him to film a fight scene, this is going to cost a lot of money. But needless to say, thanks to the generosity of that white producer to help out the Asian Bruce, they allowed him to do this and spent a lot of money to see if he was, to classify him, to let him do his thing. Now, they did this, and they took the scene, and then they went there, and they, what they call dailies, where they show what it looked like. And you need to do this to find out if somebody left the lens cover on, or in general, to see how it comes out. Making movies is a complicated process to do things, and nobody has any idea what's involved because you've never done it. So some people that do a little bit of editing for YouTube may have a tiny bit of idea, but, that's kindergarten compared to what's done in these things. And that's why there's so many people doing films, is because everybody has their own little job. There's editors, there's sound men, there's costume people, and everybody thinks that the either director or the producer does all this. No. The way a set is decorated, the way all these things have to do with the fact that other people have come in and do that. They're set decorators, where basically they know where the props are, they know what it's supposed to, but they create an image based on some basic information. So very little is done by what's happening. I mean, The Matrix was an entire copy of Japanese anime, right down to the characters with the coats and everything else. I mean, it's identical to so many other things. So people think, they didn't do that, and some other person created those sets. They didn't say, make it this way. They wrote the words, but the rest of it, to make a full picture or a complete package, is done by hundreds, if not thousands of people. So he never did that. So to shut him up, they allowed him to do that, and then they made this film. And then what happens is Van Williams took Bruce Lee into the screening room for the dailies and showed him what his stuff looked like. Took him to the back of the room while everybody else didn't know he was there, and we're watching this. And it was horrific, and people were laughing at how bad it was. And Lee himself looked at it and said, though, this is crap. What did I do? Let's get the hell out of here. And he left with Van Williams and never did that again. So that's why it's very difficult for you to be a director and an actor. And you have to have a very high level of skill. And he wasn't going to spend time learning that part of the craft. He didn't go to film school. He went to philosophy school so he could come off in front of the camera as this wise Asian. So the whole idea is that very smart to him to do it. If he would have become a director, who cares? He would have never got anywhere. He knew what his how to make the best of what he had, and that is the go to school, learn philosophy in the United States, and then take Asian philosophy in the United States, and I believe Seattle, which is not really a Asian neighborhood unlike San Francisco. So you take it from a bunch of white professors that are going to tell you what this is, and then you mold it together with other philosophies, just like he did with martial arts, and now you're this wise Chinese guy. And that's exactly how he portrayed himself. Very smart, and it worked for him. And what's unfortunate is that because he was murdered, we really never got good work out of him. If he would have came back to the United States, and to be honest with you, I don't think martial arts films, even done in a high-class Hollywood way, would have worked back then. It just was not that interesting. People love Bruce Lee all over the world, whether it's Guyana, South America, etc. Who is the big kahuna? Who is what everybody finds the best of the men of men? And that's Bruce Lee, because he looked ultimately cool and he played a hero. Just like I guess people would think that John Wayne was a great hero who never was in the military and probably couldn't fight worth a shit, most likely. So the whole idea is that, he was just a big guy. Well, I don't know what kind of skills he had. I don't think John Wayne even took boxing lessons. So he looked cool. He looked fantastic on a horse. Well, skilled riders, a lot of them don't look good on horses. So I've made this comparison before. This is the way things are. So the point is he was very smart not to do that, but knew nothing about it. So what he did is he took that same attitude that he was pulling on that set there, and he would, with stuntmen, he would tag them, meaning he would follow through and hit them because he thought this looked better. Now, you don't do that in Hollywood. That is unprofessional and not what's done. Now, there's been a few actors that did this. I mean, Quentin Tarantino stated, who was known as another little arrogant jerk, which is Robert Conrad, who used to box on the sets. When he had any kind of power on the sets, they'd have them put up boxing stuff. And he'd be boxing all the time because he was into that. Being a short little guy that he wanted to make sure he could take care of himself. And he did mostly all of his own stunts as well. Conrad, to give him credit. He did some very dangerous stunts and everything else. He was known for that. But he was very arrogant, and he used to tag people all the time as well because he thought that would give it more. But it's an arrogant thing that people do, that think they're tough, and secondly, know they're not going to really get into fights either. Now, one of the problems with his disrespect of stuntmen is, I believe it was Gene LaBelle they brought into the Green Hornet, because none of the stuntmen wanted to work with him because he kept tagging and kicking them and other things, and this was totally unprofessional. But certainly he wasn't a big star at this time. This was a goofy little TV series. So they brought in this big nasty guy who was known to pretty much break anybody there and was able to apparently control him. And LaBelle was a fantastic wrestler. And, if these wrestlers get a hold of you, you're done. He's choked out most everybody. I've seen Steven Seagal choked out. All these people have been choked out, and that's what wrestlers and grapplers do. If you're a puncher and a kicker, you can't allow yourself to be grabbed, and this goes for anybody who's big. Now, big guys always charge you, and they'll knock you to the ground while you're trying to punch them. That's not how you fight big guys. So you fight big guys through staying away from them. And what you see in Hollywood is not what real fights are about. So the whole idea is that Bruce Lee would make sure that he was never grabbed by anybody, and that's what you have to do when you fight big guys, because when it comes down to combat, the bigger guys have all the advantage. Oh, you're not fast. I'm going to grab you by your pea head and you're going to go down. That's how it works. And anybody who says any different has never been in a fight. It's so obvious when I read comments of people that know nothing about it. They're listening to some idiot that taught them while they're doing katas. Unbelievable. Or those idiots that when they want to fight, I got to take my shoes off because that's the way I learned. Yeah, I'm a martial artist. This idiot told me that. So this is the kind of nonsense you run into. So, and it also shows you the worthlessness of martial arts training in general. You should be training in street clothes because that's how you're going to be in a fight. You're going, oh, wait a minute, I got to go home and get my gi on and put a little funny belt on and take my shoes off, and we'll go to a mat. It's unbelievable the kind of nonsense you hear. So the point is that's what he ran into. This has been verified by Van Williams. This was verified by other stuntmen in Hollywood. It was known throughout Hollywood in general. And while everybody who was a fellow martial artist generally liked Bruce Lee, and he seemed to have been a very nice guy in general, and everybody has good words for him, and that was also because it's the 70s. People didn't want to criticize him. Now, when you became outspoken and want something special, well, this happened to the greatest martial artist of all time, Joe Louis. And we're not talking about the boxer. This is Joe Louis, the martial artist, who won almost any title, learned multiple systems, and was just really a fighting machine. And Bruce Lee himself said that Joe Louis was the greatest fighter, and he was. He was big, he was tough, and he knew all the systems. And he won numerous full contact karate titles. This is when he had a problem like Bruce Lee did. He said this point stuff is garbage. This guy was kind of a little tough little hillbilly type guy. He said, I don't like that, and I can't hit people. I mean, what's martial arts about? He said this, and there's in an interview with him that you can easily see on YouTube. Joe Louis. So look that up, martial artist. Now, the problem is this guy should have been a huge star, and apparently he got blackballed. Joe Louis not only was a very advanced martial artist, studied under Bruce Lee to learn some of his techniques, but developed many of his own systems and learned many systems. People say, oh, well, if he was so great, why did he well, you always study under other people and learn what they have to do. So this is nonsense. It's amazing how stupid people are. So the whole idea, and secondly, Bruce Lee was the dude. He already learned when he didn't want to put up with the Hollywood shenanigans that he got blackballed, and that was the problem. Joe Louis was a big action type star guy. He's a good looking guy. He was physically fit, and he was a advanced martial artist. On his first film, when he started to complain the fact that he wasn't getting fed properly on locations, and I think one day refused to show up to set, they promised him excellent food and gave him crackers and cheese. So he claimed that he asked the producers, look, I need to function properly, I have to have good food. I need steaks and potatoes. This is, of course, back in the 60s. I need this kind of food. I can't live on junk like this. So when he got junk like this, he protested, and they blackballed him. We never heard from him again. He did some technical work on different films. Of course, he knew Bruce Lee, trained with him, and of course started the full contact karate championships. Now, at this time, people like Bruce Lee who didn't like the fakey fighting with, what's the point? And I agree to a certain extent. This is what Chuck Norris became his world titles, and 5 of them, by the way, if not more, from this points. So the whole idea is that, now, can points be scored properly? Well, I think it can. I think you can get into the ballpark of how good somebody is by what they're doing. I don't know if you need full contact, but full contact happen. People want full contact. That's what MMA is all about. This is real full contact. So he started the full contact and, as I said, won many, many titles in that. Of course, Bruce Lee, as I've mentioned, what's the point of it? If he wins, everybody says, yeah, we know you're the best. We had to prove it. If he doesn't, well, you're a wimp. You're just a Hollywood nobody. So I don't see what would have benefited by him getting titles. But we have to remember that most martial artists in Hollywood have all been champions. Van Damme, Norris have all been champions. And if we go through the older karate stars, every single one of them have been in competitions. It's rare that they haven't. Now, Seagal hasn't. Many of Speakman, which everybody forgot about. That's what happens when you don't know how to figure things out and you're a white guy trying to make martial arts movies. He dropped by the wayside and didn't do anything. It goes on and on with these things. So, all of the thing that goes with this has to be fully understood. So the point is he tried his little hand at it, couldn't do it, and then wanted to film things the Hong Kong way, which is not the correct way to do filming. If you're doing a cheapy Hong Kong film and you want to be quickie, well, trying to set up a shot where somebody misses you by 6 inches or a foot takes too much time. So you move in, let the person make some sort of contact, and move on. Plain and simple. So, but that's not how real filming goes. So we all have to understand that of what's going on. So this is why the stuntmen didn't like him and so forth. And of course, as he grew in popularity and while he was in Hong Kong, virtually a god there, his ego grew very large, and he confronted a lot of people demanding lots of money and other things. And then he was slowly poisoned and murdered by the triads. Now, here's a guy who was young, in peak physical condition, who never had any problems before that, supposedly. There's talk about a back condition, which seems to be confirmed. And again, even his wife seems to be a little bit confused in interviews of what was talked about. So the whole idea is that these things were plain and simple, a problem that needed to be handled in a way that people could understand. And they don't understand. You don't get the full story, and people want to jump to conclusions and other things. As far as I'm concerned, I don't see any racism against Bruce Lee. If anything, he was given breaks because of that. Now, he was murdered by his own people, who also racially attacked him. So there's a whole story there, which I'll go into in my next lecture on this. So the whole idea is that's why, and that's the problem with him, because he didn't get that. So he had no technical abilities whatsoever in the area of filmmaking. Didn't really know what the right angles were because he was trained in Hong Kong. He did have the technical screen ability of what looks good, and watched his film and other people over and over again. He lived on a movie set for most of his life as a child. So he knew what facial expressions were, what looked good, the movements. So he was a genius at that, but he wasn't a genius at the technical understanding of how to make a good fight scene. And when he was given that opportunity, even after years of being in the movie industry, he messed it up. He couldn't do it. So the point is that it's also, we have to understand that fighting is different than martial arts in a tournament. Tournaments have very strict rules. If you get into a combat with someone who's a person who kills and does that type of thing, this is a totally different world. So to think that, again, that he was some great fighter, I think is totally unproven. And what's sad is that he never really had a chance to get into and develop things as he did. But, he accomplished quite a bit for a guy that was on the outside. He written several books. He had a great reputation. He was hobnobbing with all the big celebrities. It takes a lot to get. There are people that can't get film made ever that are top stars, people that can't get the funding for their films. To think that he should have walked in because he was some sort of martial artist and people pour millions of dollars on top of his head is an absurdity. You don't understand the business world. You don't understand Hollywood. Should a person who's investing millions and millions of dollars in a network TV show put up somebody who's unknown, who has a problem in terms of the fact of that he doesn't speak that clear? And you're going to put your money behind that when you can get someone else? And secondly, I think Bruce Lee would have destroyed that show. David Carradine made that into an iconic character, just like was happened in the Sherlock Holmes pictures of the 40s with Nigel Bruce, where people said, well, that's not the real character in the Sherlock Holmes novels. Who was a doctor and much more. He kind of played this comical character and made a fantastic character at it. I think those are the best Sherlock Holmes series out there. Two great actors, and of course, Nigel Bruce did a great job of creating this kind of lovable guy. And I didn't find him to be a bumbler. I just found him to be an interesting guy. Now, what Bruce Lee would have done, he would have come in there in a very arrogant stance, attacking everybody. Now, this is what David Carradine did initially. He came on basically, I guess, imitating Bruce Lee. And he came on as this tough guy, which really can't make that character work. If you come on as a tough guy, it just isn't going to work. The whole series wouldn't work. So what really happened is that the director came over to David Carradine. And again, this is on record. People have talked about it and say, look, play this much softer. And then Carradine developed this soft-spoken person who ultimately found out that the solution of most things in life is violence. And unfortunately, it's a fact. But created this soft-spoken, meditative, philosophical guy. And it's a masterstroke of what he did there with the help of directors and everything else. I don't think Bruce Lee could have pulled it off. And I think people would have rejected the fact that they couldn't understand him that well. And that's one of the biggest problems with Lee. And what he should have been doing is getting numerous voice coaches and working on his accent, trying to speak more direct English. Now, you notice people like the Chinese stars of today, a lot of them, or at least the more consummate actors, other than Jackie Chan, who doesn't really want to speak English and still speaks poor English, but I think it's, Wo Fat, I forget his name there. I mean, he speaks almost perfect English, and he's worked on that. And of course, these people did grow up in Hong Kong. They heard English. This was a British Commonwealth for 100 years. So he should have spent more time on that. He went to school, he went other things, but he couldn't get rid of that unfortunate clarity problem. So this would have been overlooked probably in our day and age now, but it wouldn't going to be overlooked back then. And to put that out on TV, people would have had a fit. And quite frankly, I don't think that the networks, I believe it was ABC, would have allowed that. They would have seen the pilot of that with him in it, and they would have rejected it, and we wouldn't have had Kung Fu at all. They would have either replaced him or said, we can't go with this guy. So you have to understand the real world out there. And very few people are going to invest money into something that is almost guaranteed to fail. Now, everybody can look at different times, other things. But the point is that's it. And that was the problem. And nobody wanted to work with him. He didn't treat people properly that way because he didn't consider this macho fighting and like they did in Hong Kong. So the point is he's trying to equate Hong Kong movies with Hollywood in general. And Hollywood in general has always done things in a non-aggressive manner. And there's a safe way of doing this. Hitting each other is dangerous. If a big guy hits Lee, he's going to hurt him. Does Lee want that? Well, since he's doing all the aggression, he didn't look at it that way. But, it's a two-edged sword there. And we have to be very careful of what that is. So this has been noted. It's been noted by anybody who's been in Hollywood. They've heard this about him. And I don't know if this is horribly negative. The point is, like everything else in life, he was a great martial artist. He changed an entire tradition into mixed martial arts the way it should be instead of, I'm Korean, I only know Korean. This is all nonsense, which is perpetuated all of culture, basically. And some of the worst racists in the world are the Chinese and the Japanese. That's the way it is. And if you don't know that, or anybody who basically says they're better than somebody else, which is really based on, where you popped out of mommy on this planet. So the whole idea is that this is the reality. It's about time everybody understands that and why these things are happening. But it amazes me that nobody cares that he was murdered by his own people. So, and of course, this continued years later, where I believe also his son was murdered. As this happens as going after people as a way of teaching the world that if you screw us over, we'll go after you. It happened with the Kennedys, and it happened, of course, in so many people who have these kinds of problems where they generationally go after your family. And this happens to this day from organized crime, who will harass you for your entire life and go after your family as well. So this is all a very critical area that is being perpetrated out there to be understood. People have to understood the way that Bruce Lee acted and what he thought was macho and everything to go with that. And quite frankly, he was given a lot more breaks, I think, than he deserved. If he was taken by a major American studio, which we'll never know, of course, Americans did over there. I think it was Enter the Dragon, his last film with Chuck Norris. This obviously was heads and shoulders against better than the Hong Kong films in terms of they had a Hollywood producer go over there, work with the Chinese people, producers over there, I think Raymond Chong or Chow or whatever his name was, and made a pretty good film. And if that was taken into later times, this one. But, as an international star, everybody loves this guy. This is the guy that is the ultimate hero for everybody that everybody wants to be. So no matter where you go from Sri Lanka to Buenos Aires, you're going to find posters of Bruce Lee and people that love that very theatrical fighting style. And certainly he was a very competent, powerful martial artist. And certainly, I don't think that very many people could have successfully fought him. But if we talk about master martial artists fighting each other or in competition, well, we just don't know how he would do. I tend to think that just because of his traditions and his size, that he would have great difficulties fighting bigger opponents, and in general didn't really have the advanced competition type training like Norris did and Joe Louis. These people were fighters for years. I mean, Chuck Norris was on doing martial arts in a championship or a competition for many, many years. This teaches you how to go up against different opponents. I'm not sure what Lee knew or not, but we don't want to discount that this guy was deadly, that this guy was very skilled and knew it. But he also didn't get certain things. With all his intelligence and all his learning of things, he didn't understand or take the time to, well, what's happening behind the camera to make me look good? Because most likely he couldn't do that in Hong Kong. They wouldn't allow him to do that. So when he came over here, he didn't think he could do it either. When given the opportunity, he failed and failed horribly. So that's the real story. The information that Quentin Tarantino and other people got was not made up by him. His story was not made up by him. He based his script on a book and other books and information he read about and got from other people. It's not exactly unknown. But Lee is one of those people you don't criticize in Hollywood very much unless you're in a particular area. And the bottom line is that stuntmen didn't like him. It was well known, and that's the reason why. It ain't complicated, makes a lot of sense, and that's the way it is.